Late in the dark evening of July 2nd, my submariners began arriving aboard the boat in small groups, trying not to arouse suspicion about our imminent departure to sea. This conspiracy was necessary to conceal the boat's departure from the night shift of French dockers. At midnight, we took the moorings off the bollards. I steered the boat away from the concrete bunker and steered her into the night darkness. At 0200 U for 15 began her final trip, still without the schnorkel. As soon as the boat reached sufficient depth under the keel, we went under. To conserve fuel, we moved at low speeds to the west. I was tasked to operate in the 200-mile coastal zone, approximately 80 miles off the coast. We were to prevent enemy destroyers and landing craft from entering Brest Bay. U for 15 had now become a ghost. With limited mobility, questionable combat capability, with the extreme need to surface for air ventilation and battery recharging under the constant threat of air attack, the submarine became a floating coffin, a target for attacks by enemy aircraft, always ready to send her to the bottom. As the new day dawned, I put the boat on the bottom. Her bow touched the sandy bottom like the head of a grazing horse. All the engines were started and the instruments turned off, the crew sent to bed. With the onset of low tide, the boat skimmed the bottom, rose to the surface, moved farther out to sea, then lay low again. These maneuvers were repeated at regular intervals. On the second night, we ventured to spend 5 endless minutes on the surface ventilating the compartments. As the pulses of the Azteca intensified, we went underwater and continued our silent movement in a submerged position close to the bottom. The rumble of explosions, sporadically coming from the English Channel, reminded us that the British were in constant search of targets. After 40 hours, U for 15 arrived in the target area. At the lowest speeds, we followed underwater 30-meter depth to the north. Our acoustician did not hear the slightest noise resembling the sound of rotating propellers. Toward the end of the day, as the time to surface approached, our hearts beat harder and more frequently. Then we rose to the surface in the silence of the night. For a little over 20 minutes, the Tommies didn't bother us. Then their planes began to appear. We made an emergency dive. At the moment when the thickness of the sea water closed the submarine, a hail of depth bombs fell on us. The sudden bombardment had an overwhelming effect on my new chief engineer. Unable to control the boat, he drove it into chaotic motion. We felt like we were on a roller coaster ride and faced the dangerous alternative of either crashing to the bottom or surfacing and exposing ourselves to the enemy's deadly blast. I rushed to the chief engineer's seat, brought the boat out of its disorderly motion, leveled it, and got it to move slowly on an even keel. Then, taking a deep breath, said to his stunned chief engineer, "Proceed as follows, Zelda. This is our course." Still shaken, he set about his duties. It was the first time a sailor had been bombed, the first time he had felt death so closely. I realized that I would have to put up with his unpreparedness until he got used to the combat situation. With the first bombardment, our dance of death began. All night long, we were eagerly catching moments to surface to recharge batteries and ventilate the air. An hour before dawn, during our last surfacing of the night, we managed to almost complete the recharging of the batteries. After the deafening bursts of the warheads of another bomb cassette, we lurked in the depths, exhausted, depleted, and tired. The Allied destroyers, which we were supposed to attack and destroy, did not appear on the third or fourth day. At night, I lowered the boat to the bottom, where it was so quiet that only the breathing of the men and the faint scraping from the bow of the boat rubbing against the sand were distinguishable. However, the need for air and power forced us to continue dangerous surfacing and diving under the rumble of bursting depth bombs. Still, U for 15 persevered, waiting for the enemy ships to appear. While the Royal Air Force pilots spared no expense in destroying ours and other lone U-boats, the British ships paid no attention to us. Not one of them appeared in our patrol area. I carefully surveyed our quadrant for a week, but did not encounter a single Allied destroyer or landing craft. On the 9th night of useless patrolling, I dared to test the vigilance of the British pilots by transmitting a radiogram to base that read, "Patrol area free of shipping," awaiting new instructions. Immediately after the transmission, we had underwater and at a depth of 25 meters began to wait for a response from headquarters. He ordered us to return to Brest. We made the return passage in only 42 hours on the waves of the incoming tide, which carried us to the neck of Brest Bay. Late in the evening of July 13th, we arrived at the rendezvous point with the escort. A quick surfacing, a quick response to the escort's call signs, and U for 15 followed it into port. At 10:25 p.m., I carefully brought my boat into the bunker under the protection of a 7-meter concrete canopy. Her engines had stalled. When Captain Winter came over the gangway to board the boat, he saw the green faces of my submariners lined up on deck. Winter took my report and greeted the crew with a smile that covered his deep concern. As he went around the line, he turned to me and said in a muffled voice, "You have been recalled for a special assignment. Contact my senior naval engineer and discuss with him matters that require immediate attention. Within 3 days you should be ready. That is the only time we can give you for training." I saluted and climbed onto the bridge. Here the flotilla engineer was talking to my chief engineer. I heard him say to him, "And I propose to take the boat out of the bay no later than 0700 hours. Any objections?" I had an objection. I hadn't slept for 10 hours. The crew was exhausted and needed rest too. I had to say grimly to the XO, "Prepare the boat for maneuvers at 0900 sharp. Tell the cook to wake me up at 0700. Any questions?" "Not yet, Herr Oberleutnant." "Very well. Dismiss the crew. Make sure there's no drinking tonight, or I'll have to punish those responsible." Slowly waking up, I could still hear the rumble of the bursting depth charges in my hazy dreams. The last burst made me open my eyes. I was convinced that I was not at sea, but in my room in the harbor, and someone was pounding my door with his fists. Half asleep, I opened the inner door and shouted into the lobby, "Enough, I hear it." Through the front door came the voice of the duty officer. "Herr Oberleutnant, you were supposed to go to sea at 7, but it is now 10 o'clock. We've been trying to wake you up since 7 this morning." "Thank you. Go to the bunker and tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. Angry at myself for oversleeping, I dressed quickly, went down the stairs, jumping 5 steps, and in the bright sunlight headed further down the winding path to the bunker. As I turned through the doorway, I saw my boat. She was moving stern forward with her diesel engine smoking. I was blown away. The XO had no authority to take her out without my instructions. Just as I was contemplating the form of the reprimand, a rumbling explosion shook the air. At the spot where the boat had just been standing, a powerful fountain of water soared into the sky. Then the stern of the U-15 rose out of the water like one end of a floating log, throwing the 2 submariners overboard. Powerful jets of water rained down on the boat. U-15 had hit a mine. She turned starboard and moved by inertia toward the stone fence of the inner bay. For a moment, the sight of the dying boat paralyzed me. Coming to my senses, I jumped into the motorboat and raced to the U-15. When I reached the pier, the boat hit the stone wall with its bow. At that moment, I was already beside her. Engineers and sailors were climbing out of the hull through the hatch with bleeding wounds, pale and shaken. Some were limping, others were dragging themselves. The boat began to lurch to port. I climbed on her, climbed on the bridge, and began to help the submariners get out of the narrow hatch opening. "There are still people in the aft compartments, dead or unconscious," said the motorist. "Drag them to the central station room." I shouted to him. The motorman did not answer. The wounded continued up the gangway. Some had hurt their arms, others their legs. When the stream of men from below had dried up, I went down to the central station room. I was followed by 2 non-commissioned officers who remained unharmed. Inside the hull, everything was ruined. Pipes, spigots, adapters, switches, valves, and other pieces of equipment were lying on the deck plates and in the bottom. A stream of dirty, stinking water was rushing through a wide crack in the hull into the aft torpedo bay, quickly filling the boat. 3 submariners lay in serious condition on the deck plates of the diesel compartment. 2 more were sprawled between the electric motors in the aft section. As the sub filled with oily fluid and gradually lurching to port, 3 of us dragged the heavy bodies of the motorists into the forward compartments. Someone opened the forward hatch, which was still above water. By common efforts, we pulled the motorists out of the hull and loaded them on one of the motorboats that approached U-15. The roll of the submarine became threatening. Her stern was swallowed by the sea. As soon as I got into the motorboat, the good old workhorse slid down the stone wall and tipped over on her port side. Her deck disappeared into the dark abyss of the sea. Then, jerked upward one last time, the deckhouse and bridge sank into the water, and the whole submarine went to the bottom. U-15 no longer existed. I had not yet taken my eyes off the side of the submarine's demise when a motorboat touched the pier. To me, limping, came the extremely discouraged XO. Irritated by his unauthorized removal of the boat from the bunker, I shouted, "You'll have to answer for this, XO." "Herr Oberleutnant, I was ordered to take the boat out of the anchorage by the chief engineer of the flotilla. He's been waiting for you for an hour and has lost patience. The chief engineer is not your superior, XO. He can't give orders when it comes to the boat. You should know that." Now, gather everyone who isn't hurt and count them. I'll escort the wounded to the hospital. I believe, Herr Oberleutnant, that 2 of our men are dead. Yes, I saw them thrown up. Take a motorboat and look for them in the bay. Maybe the bodies are floating around somewhere. If you find them, report back to me immediately. The powerful explosion attracted the attention of the crews of the other subs, as well as dockers, laborers, and shipyard workers. There were many who wanted to help. As we carried the badly wounded to the ambulances, I was able to get a good look at them. All had broken legs, feet twisted backwards, toes flattened. Some had damaged internal organs and were moaning in pain. Others were unconscious, their heads bleeding. I sat in the ambulance next to a badly wounded electrician, and it rushed through the streets of Brest to the wail of sirens. It occurred to me that U-15 was blown up on a mine on July 14th, the national holiday of France, the day of the taking of the Bastille. The demise of the U-15 was a gift from the British to the French on that day. My boat was blown up on a mine dropped on the night of May 28th. The rumble of her diesels was picked up by a sound-catching clockwork mechanism, and yet I decided that fate was favorable to U-15. She was not sunk at sea, where we would have found our grave, but perished in port, where there was still a chance of salvation. Why didn't I wake up in time? Why did the XO give in to the chief engineer's demands? These questions plagued me. And why had I survived 1,000 bomb blasts at sea when others were dying? Apparently, neither heaven nor hell needed me. When I arrived at the hospital, some of my injured submariners were already lying on the operating table. The 5 we had rescued from the aft compartments were still unconscious. The fractures to their legs and arms were not severe, but the doctors reported that 2 sailors had sustained serious back injuries. Skull injuries and concussions were sustained by 2 others. They were hurt when they hit the deck plates. When I left the hospital, I left 14 of my guys there. Back at the base, I met a distraught Captain Winter. The chief engineer had already informed him of his fateful order. Since his position was considered second in command of the base, Winter was in a difficult position. Under the circumstances, he had no way of holding his superior accountable, and I could only get the XO fired. However, I forgave the first watchman's excuse for not daring to contradict the chief engineer. I convinced myself that the XO was only following orders from a higher authority. The loss of U-15 only added to the statistics of the loss of our submarine fleet. During the first 2 weeks of July, my last cruise, we lost 11 submarines not equipped with schnorkels. Almost all that the base had. 2 more boats with schnorkels were sunk in the English Channel, reducing the number of subs sent to counter Allied landings to 5. With the loss of U-15, U-13 remained the only submarine without a schnorkel of those that put to sea on the evening of June 6th. She was still in dry dock awaiting the end of the repair work. Meanwhile, the 5 remaining submarines with schnorkels used their air intake devices to remain in a submerged position and not be subjected to enemy airstrikes. They continued raids in the English Channel and even achieved some successes. U-953 sank 3 destroyers, U-984 sent to the bottom 3 transports and 1 patrol ship. The same achieved U-763. In these terrible 2 weeks, no more than 3 or 4 submarines simultaneously attacked convoys that delivered Allied manpower and military equipment from southern British ports to the beaches of Normandy. There might have been about 100 subs there had they not been needlessly sacrificed earlier. With the collapse of the German submarine fleet and with it the Luftwaffe, Allied losses on the sea supply routes became minimal. New divisions, fully manned and equipped with thousands of tanks and vehicles, poured onto the Normandy coast, putting in huge floating piers taken from Britain. The Allies soon captured Cherbourg, providing a base for large-scale operations. The German armies could not prevent them from driving wedges into their battle orders and advancing deep into French territory. Avranches fell, and American forces moved along the northern coast of Brittany, approaching Brest. The day after the loss of the U-15, I first of all went to the hospital to visit the wounded submariners. Most of them were in stable condition, hands and feet plastered. 5 of the seriously wounded were lying completely in plaster, 2 of them still not recovered. I brought them cigarettes and tobacco. It was all that could be offered to the innocent victims of a tragic mistake. When I returned to the base compound, one of my non-commissioned officers reported that the British radio station Calais had mentioned our boat in its broadcast this morning. Herr Oberleutnant, the announcer said that you sank the boat yourself so that you would no longer go to sea in an obsolete submarine ship. I replied with a smile. Now you see how quickly the British gather and disseminate information. This should serve as a lesson to each of us. Day after day, I spent impatiently awaiting my new assignment, preparing the rest of the crew unharmed for the inevitable return to Germany. While my command was deciding my fate, I visited Heinz Cedar, who had returned from the campaign, met Marbach on the pier, and listened to Cordes' account of his dramatic return to base. The four of us celebrated their progress, eager to reminisce about the good old days, consuming copious amounts of champagne and fine seafood. If any of us feasters feared in our hearts the terrible outcome of the war, we did not admit it even to ourselves. As before, we remained hopeful and confident of ultimate victory. I was convinced that the war would undergo a dramatic reversal as soon as a sufficient number of our miracle boats were produced, and believed I would soon receive one. Then came July 20th. At noon, when I returned from the hospital, the duty officer told me that Captain Winter was waiting for me in the officers' mess hall. To my surprise, the entire officer staff of the flotilla had gathered there. Everyone realized that only an extremely important event could have caused such a gathering. Many speculations were made, and the tension was rising. When Winter and his staff entered the room, with a petrified face he demanded silence. "Gentlemen, I am authorized to inform you of the contents of a teletype I received from the command." That morning, an attempt was made on the Führer's life. However, he escaped tragically. The conspirator, an army officer, has been arrested. I can assure you that the Navy had nothing to do with the plot. Everything remains as before. The war will continue until the end of the war. This message has shocked us. The fact that someone had attempted to assassinate the idol of the nation was beyond our comprehension. Our reactions to it ranged from disbelief to extreme concern. The meeting broke up in confusion and anger. The news soon spread throughout the compound. The crews of the remaining submarines and maintenance personnel were informed of it before they learned of it from the broadcast of the British radio station Calais. I returned to my room in great distress. Of course, I recognized that there was a certain number of dissatisfied people back home. That was natural when there had been a long war with great loss and destruction. But I did not suppose that there could be organized opposition to the regime, preparing treasonable plots and attempts at open rebellion. I feared that the assassination attempt on the Führer might have weakened the morale of the Germans. This event in the life of the Navy had only one obvious consequence. The salute was abolished, and members of all branches and branches of the armed forces had to salute each other as party members did. As a result, many ridiculously funny situations arose when the newly introduced salute was responded to by soldiers saluting in the old way. In other respects, the war continued as usual. It steadily worsened our situation. The time of sad farewells had begun. On July 21st, two tugs dragged U-15 along the bottom of the bay to dry dock. I was assigned to dismantle her valuable equipment and seize service documents. I went to the dock, bringing my officers and some of the crew with me. We found our boat lying on her starboard side. There was a wide gaping hole in the stern of the hull, the spandrels were broken, the tanks were torn, the bollers were bent, the steering gear and horizontal rudders were torn off. All that remained of the U-15 was scrap metal. I instructed my deputies to supervise the dismantling and left. 2 days later, the sea brought to the surface the bodies of two of our submariners who had died in the mine explosion. A patrol minesweeper brought them to the port. On July 25th, we buried the dead in a small cemetery in the outskirts of the city. To pay the last tribute to the submariners, who died for unknown reasons, all my crew came to the cemetery in dress uniform with rifles, to some of which were bayonets. A wreath was also brought to their grave from Winter. Then, to a volley of 24 rifles, the wooden coffins were slowly lowered into the ground. I spent the rest of the day writing letters to the relatives of the deceased. What could I say to parents who had to assume that their sons had died as heroes in battle? I took out a splendid piece of writing paper with thin framing lines around the edges, a black cross in the upper left corner, and began to write. It took me a long time to find the right words and phrases. I was not sorry to see July come to an end. Over the past few months, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The large Allied forces advancing from Normandy met with little resistance from our troops. There was a threat that they cut off Brittany from the rest of France, depriving us of escape routes to Germany. The threat to the submarine bases on the Atlantic coast grew daily. Life in the recently busy ports of Brest, Lorraine, and Street-Nazaire came to a standstill with the death of their submarine flotillas. In July alone, 18 more were sunk by air attacks. Among these casualties were U-212 and U-214, unequipped schnorkels that went to sea to protect the base bay from enemy warships. British destroyers, which had begun to tighten the blockade loop around our port, sent both boats to the bottom. In July, I said goodbye forever to my friends Zos and Zyder, commanders of U-13 and U-984. Each of these boats went out to hunt at sea, but both of them, along with their crews, perished on the same day. Having said goodbye to my closest friends, I felt increasingly unwanted. Command had not yet made a decision on the future of our crew. Captain Winter's attempts to help us were fruitless. Seeing no prospects, I began to prepare for war on land. The siege of Brest was approaching. As American tanks rolled south through the hills of Brittany, our troops began to retreat to Brest, which had been declared a fortress. Defensive fortifications were being feverishly built everywhere in the city. My submariners were issued rifles and machine guns, and I was ordered to prepare my crew for fighting on land. For us, the prospects of being trapped and captured in Brest became quite real. One day in early August, I was returning with my team from a field exercise when I was told to report to the senior officer. The usually somber Winter greeted me with a smile on his face. "You're in luck. You've been appointed captain of U-953. Congratulations." I was surprised and delighted. The fact is that Marbach, the captain of the submarine, went to the headquarters in Berlin to receive the Knight's Cross. However, as it turned out, the Allied offensive prevented his return. "In an hour you will receive the boat's crew," Winter continued. "As you know, she is equipped with a snorkel, and its repair will take about 10 days. Prepare yourselves." For Captain, I am immensely pleased. My new assignment has completely changed my future. Instead of being trapped in the fortress of Brest, being killed on land, or ending up in a prisoner of war camp, I would at least be able to fight and die at sea. That was what I knew how to do and what I was called to do. At the appointed hour, I took command of the submarine Marbach. Most of the crew knew me or had heard of me. This contributed to a quick bonding between the new commander and the boat's crew. Since part of the crew of U-953 went on leave and was unable to return, I manned the missing men with motor officers and sailors from U-15 who showed great interest in serving on the new submarine. To avoid fighting on land, they were glad to go to sea and wanted to fight British destroyers even if only in single lifeboats. In preparation for going to sea, the days passed quickly. My assembled crew worked selflessly, striving under acute time constraints to accomplish as much work as possible and to compensate for the lack of reliable, skilled men in dry dock. The Allied offensive stimulated an ever-increasing stream of refusals by French ship repairers to cooperate with the German conquerors. Some of them were fleeing literally after breakfast. Even worse, those who remained at the dock were more hostile than loyal and required constant supervision. Meanwhile, most of the remaining out-of-work submariners from U-15 had gone to the trenches girdling Brest, while those who remained in my charge were constantly besieged by employees of the German civil administration, offering large bribes to be ferried home in our boat when she went to sea from the Brest trap. In this turmoil, we were unable to keep to the schedule of preparations for the campaign. Brest was awaiting siege, while Allied units and formations were moving rapidly from Normandy, threatening Paris, encircling Lorient, and approaching Street Nazir. More and more of our troops were pouring into Brest. The local population hid in their homes and awaited further developments with mixed feelings of fear, exultation, and stoicism. The command gave the order to evacuate Brest, Lorient, and Street Nazir too late. By the time Denit's order came, the British had blocked all possible exits from the bay. Large flotillas of warships were sent south, blockading the three ports. Every night, planes dropped mines in areas of shipping lines, paralyzing the movement of all surface ships and forcing U-boats to advance in deadly conditions. As well as hunting for U-boats at sea, the Royal Air Force continually launched increasingly massive raids on our naval bases. The pitiful remnants of the retreat increased confusion and even gave birth to panic. The atmosphere in the fortress of Brest became explosive. The city was declared free from restrictions in receiving our troops. A strict curfew was imposed on the population. The dry dock was guarded by Marines. All anti-aircraft installations were moved to strategic positions to reinforce the outer edge of the city's defenses. Heavily armed units of military sailors patrolled the city and the surrounding area. The Naval College, once belonging to the famed First Flotilla, was turned into a command center for the defense of Brest because of the extensive underground tunnel system there. The 9th Submarine Flotilla was disbanded and its commander transferred to Norway. In farewell, he managed to do the almost impossible, to send to sea U-256 under the command of Bodenberg. This old submarine, having received orders to go to sea and even a snorkel, slipped stealthily out of the inner bay and broke through the cordon of British warships near the rocks. Now it was time for Captain Winter to wind things up. He had moved the first flotilla's most valuable property and equipment to the underground facilities, managing to fend off the harassment of the military with honor. A large number of arrogant army officers, who had avoided fighting to save the Reich and had had a good time in France, arrived at the port with their wives and carloads of personal effects, collections of wines of various varieties and champagne. They demanded that their belongings be transported to Germany by submarine, and were greatly angered when Winter rejected their advances. The situation became extremely aggravated when the first shots rang out on the city's defensive lines and the first American Sherman tanks showed up in front of the trenches. In the days of chaos, when military sailors were the only defenders of Brest and no one knew where the defensive lines were or when the Allies would launch an offensive, there were only two boats left in the ill-fated port, U-953 and U-247. Their repairs at the dock were coming to an end, which allowed the hope that they would break free. The first to break free was U-247. She was lost with her crew. Now there was only my submarine left. On August 19th, U-953 was finally considered suitable for going to sea, with some limitations, though. The diesels were in a deplorable condition. The batteries should have been replaced long ago, but there was neither material nor time for that. In short, the repairs were only preventive. Of course, we had no opportunity to make training dives or try out the snorkel. Relying on the dedication and tirelessness of each submariner, we doubled our vigilance on watch, trying to prevent attempts by French underground fighters to sabotage our boat. We managed to stock up on fuel and food. To my amazement, I was ordered not to take on board torpedoes, but to load the boat and the tubes of the torpedo apparatuses with valuable equipment and instruments, and to take high-ranking persons with me out of the trap. This valuable cargo was ordered to be taken to the southern port of La Rochelle, whence civilians could still reach home via France. I critically analyzed the situation and concluded that if the boat was intended to rescue civilians, then the remaining submariners from U-415 needed it all the more. Having obtained Winter's permission to take them aboard, I sought out all my men who had been sent to the trenches, took them to the hospital for treatment, and said goodbye to those subordinates who had been forced by their wounds to remain in besieged Brest. I then ordered both commands to leave all unnecessary things on land and saw to their departure from the base compounds. When we arrived at the pier, I was confronted by a large group of crying and gesticulating civilians, French and German, who were trying to force their way aboard the submarine. The guards were endeavoring to push the excited people back onto the pier. Some of them were so aggressive that they had to be taken at gunpoint to keep them at bay. The combined crew quickly lined up for roll call on the aft deck. 6 civilians with tense faces stood on the bridge. The XO reported the number of men on the boat. The total turned out to be 99 men, 45 more than the manual called for. In an effort to moderate the passions of the remaining people on the pier, I deliberately raised my voice and said, "I want to emphasize that this crossing will be one of the hardest. The crew of the boat must be at battle stations. The main responsibility will fall on the shoulders of the permanent crew. It will be assisted, if necessary, by the crew of U-415. Work, eat, and sleep will have to work without changing their place. Exclude unnecessary movements and conversations. Tin cans will be placed in convenient locations for sanitary purposes. I want you to know that the coastal waters are swarming with enemy ships. Our chances of getting through are slim. 10 to 1 we can't get through the British barrier to La Rochelle, so don't be under any illusions. We must be ready to put to sea immediately. Not a step off the boat, for whatever reason." I dismissed the submariners and turned to the 6 civilians. They were horrified to learn of the dangers ahead. 2 grabbed their luggage and hurried off the boat. I was amused and relieved by their departure. It gave us at least a little but more space. 4 of the braver ones followed me below deck. The center aisle and all compartments except the central station room were crammed with bulky equipment, wooden crates, suitcases, and cardboard boxes. In the forward torpedo compartment, cargo was stowed in the bottom, on torpedo-free racks, in the torpedo tube. I told the 4 guests not to go anywhere, leaving them there in utter confusion. I then went to report to Winter that the submarine was ready to go to sea. As I walked up to the top of the hill on the winding path into the compound, I heard the muffled rattle of machine guns to the north and saw Winter's adjutant hurrying down. Out of breath, he reported that I was to take aboard 4 more specialists whom the Reich could not afford to give to the Americans. Since these valuable persons could not arrive on the boat until morning, our departure to sea was delayed for 24 hours. In indignation, I turned back to the pier, because it was clear that the longer we remained in port, the more difficult it would be to get through the blockade to La Rochelle. Soon the aroma of goulash was spreading in the hull of the boat. The submariners and guests, seated on crates, suitcases, piping, and bunks, devoured the dinner they thought would be their last in port. The radio was broadcasting pleasant melodic music. I was sitting at a tiny table in my corner plotting the crossing when the music quieted and the English announcer began to broadcast the news. The transmission is addressed to our friends the submariners in Brest. The time has come for you to stop taking part in the fighting. If you leave port with a white flag on your periscope, we will treat you with respect. But if you choose to fight, you will face a swift demise. It is with great excitement that I say this to you, the crew of the U-953, who will have to go to sea again. I can tell you that dozens of British destroyers are waiting to meet you. They'll send you to the bottom if you dare to fight. I warn you, this will be your last. This was too much. I shouted angrily into the radio room. Get that cretin off the air, find some music. But, Herr Captain, said the radio operator, this is the only radio station we can catch in the bunker. Then spin the records. On the morning of August 21st, the last 4 guests arrived aboard the submarine with a lot of luggage and instruments. I did not allow them to take so much luggage, and after a heated altercation the newcomers parted with their personal belongings. I placed them in the aft torpedo room and told them that they must not come out of there under any circumstances, must eat, sleep, and possibly die there. I then ordered the boat hatches to be tightly battened down, the radio to be turned off, and the batteries to be recharged to full power. When I stepped off the boat, both diesels were smoking and murmuring in the shallow water of the parking lot. I stepped out of the cool bunker into the bright sunlight and summer heat, then began to climb the hill to report to the local authorities one last time. The rock bunker was swarming with men in army uniforms. Many of the officers wore dress uniforms more suited for a gala meeting at the Paris Opera than for the defense of the fortress of Brest. Disorder and nervousness were conspicuous. Army ambulances stopped in front of the underground tunnels, unloading new victims of the battle for Brest. Along the outer line of trenches a fierce battle was now underway. American tanks had already broken into the fortress in some places. I ran through the tunnel looking for Winter. Someone had said he'd gone into the compound. The whine of the heavy anti-aircraft guns continued as I reached the emptied compound. Black scatterings of shells were exploding in the sky 700 meters to the north. On the flat roof of the southeast wing of the building, I noticed several men in naval uniforms watching the battle to the north through binoculars. I rushed up the stairs and found Winter. He and his staff officers were expressing satisfaction with the results of our anti-aircraft fire. An American tank had been hit, coming up the road that led to the Naval College. Winter had already resigned himself to the fact that the leadership of the defense of Brest and its flotilla of one submarine had passed to an elderly, nervous general with a monocle. I turned to my immediate superior and reported that U-953 was ready to go to sea. You may leave at your discretion, said Winter. When do you expect to leave? After sunset, Herr Captain. 21.30. I'll be there to see you off. But please don't make a fuss. I don't want the dockers to get suspicious. As we were coming down the hill, the air raid sirens began to wail. We ran to the entrance to the next underground tunnel. A few seconds later, the hill shuddered with an endless series of powerful explosions. I followed Winter into the vast network of tunnels, past the many beds occupied by the wounded. I glanced at the pale faces of the German nurses, who were facing a bleak future. Nearby, ruffled French maidens bustled about, fearfully awaiting the resolution of their fate as collaborators. Their now worthless cavaliers strode haughtily out in boots and shining uniforms with red stripes on the galleys. I saw also confused sailors and infantrymen waiting for the most ridiculous orders. The bombardment did not cease. Everything in the catacombs, the ground, the bunks, the scurrying men, was drowned in the roar of the anti-aircraft guns and vibrated with the rumbling explosions. In 30 minutes, the massive air raid was over. When everything calmed down and the sirens announced the cancellation of the air raid, Winter and I returned to the compound. At the sight of it, we were overcome with mute despair. What had just been a complex of stately granite buildings had been almost completely destroyed by the Allies. With the loss of the college, the fate of the first submarine flotilla was finally sealed. Winter stood in the ruins of his business. Other than sending his last submarine to sea, there was nothing else he could do. I realized that he wanted to be left to himself, so I slowly walked back to the boat. Time, August 22, 1944. 9:20 p.m. Only a few sailors had gone on deck to handle the moorings. I stood on the bridge waiting for Winter's farewell visit. At 9:22 p.m., he crossed the gangway. Responding to my greeting, he said, "Take good care of the boys and the boat. Good luck to you." "You too, her captain. I hope to meet you soon in more favorable conditions. The main thing for you is to get out of here before it's too late." With a few commands, the moorings are taken off the bollards and the gangways taken to the pier. U-953 silently pulled out of the parking lot. Carefully, without a sound, she slipped into the middle of the inner bay. This was necessary so as not to engage the acoustic mines. I stopped the boat and descended into the hull, then the chief engineer made a test dive. The atmosphere inside the hull was a travesty of naval instructions and safety conditions. Passageways were cluttered with valuable passenger equipment. Communications between the various compartments were severely hampered. The weight of the extra cargo plus the number of people, twice the normal number, posed serious problems for the chief engineer in controlling the boat. It took him more than an hour to determine the submarine's buoyancy and balance parameters required under emergency conditions. U-953 surfaced and approached the escort, probably the only one afloat. The night was moonless. Everything was plunged into pitch blackness. The escort moved forward. We followed. When the U-953 passed the anti-submarine nets, I turned on the diesels. After the rocks disappeared and radar pulses began to flash on the radar screen, I realized that we were pulanged. Suddenly, a flare flashed 200 meters ahead. At the same instant, we were signaled by flashlight from the escort, "Attention! British torpedo boats in attack position. Prepare for battle." I did not expect such an encounter with the British and called upstairs calculations of anti-aircraft gunners. "Watch the torpedo boats. Fire on visible targets," I ordered. The flares went out, and the sea turned black again. The escort stopped, forcing us to do the same. We were now exposed to a threat we could not see, and we could not fire, as the smaller caliber guns were ineffective against an attack directly ahead. To take the fight, I had to turn the U-953 with the bow toward Brest and the guns against the gunboats. But the boat could not move stern forward. I signaled the escort to move forward slowly and constantly launch flares. I wanted to meet the torpedo boats in deeper water. But as soon as we advanced further, I noticed dozens of shadows prepared to attack from a distance of 800 meters. I loudly commanded, "Both diesels, full ahead, left rudder." U-953 reluctantly turned around, pitching her side toward the attacking enemy for a few endless seconds. As the boat completed the turn, our guns opened fire. We hurried back to port, denying the torpedo boats the opportunity to aim and fire their deadly torpedoes. The gunboats, vastly superior to us in speed, approached rapidly in the light of the flares. But then just as suddenly as they had appeared, they turned and headed out to sea. The incident buried my hopes of getting out of the bay that night and possibly any other night. The torpedo boats were not only dangerous in themselves, they indicated the presence of a considerable flotilla of patrol vessels nearby. It seemed that our return to Brest was final and we were doomed to blow up our boat and share the fate of the besieged garrison of the city. At dawn, the U-953 sneaked back into the harbor. I warned the submariners and guests to stay away from the dockers and to keep silent regarding the night's adventure. Then I closed myself again with the green curtain in my corner and tried to find a way out of the harbor. The only option left was to leave in an underwater position. This maneuver was fraught with a number of dangers: run aground, hit a mine, get caught in a strong current. It had never been used before. But I calculated that at low tide we could reach the neck of the bay unnoticed without an escort, then dive deep enough for the water to cover the bridge of the boat. After that, we would be left with a slim chance of escaping the trap on the tidal waves. I quietly rose from my bunk while the 100 men aboard the boat slumbered peacefully, trusting in my ability to lead them to freedom. I walked through the deserted bunker and the grounds beside it. I found Winter and his staff entourage in the underground shelter. As I recounted the torpedo boat incident and my plan to outsmart the Tommies, he looked at me with a concerned, grim, and tired look. After wishing me a happy journey, he then asked, "Would you like to join me on a trip through the trenches?" "Her captain, I wish I could, but I must prepare for a night out. I haven't slept in days." "You may miss something that no one else will be able to tell posterity," Winter said grimly. Then, suppressing his excitement with ostentatious severity, he added, "Never mind, though. Be well behaved. I can't say goodbye to you on the pier. Business keeps me here." We shook hands again. I left with the conviction that I'd never see him again. On August 23rd at 2:55, I pulled back the green curtain in my corner, put on my leather jacket, entered the dimly lit room of the central station, and reminded the chief engineer of the necessity to dive quickly and accurately on the first command. Then I took my place on the bridge. At 3:05, I took U-953 out of the bunker, not to return to it again. As the boat slid silently into the darkness towards the neck of the bay, beyond which the enemy was waiting for us, I cast a last glance at the city that remained astern. The shores with their extensive docks and shipyards were barely visible. Against the night sky, the bombed-out naval college on the hilltop was barely distinguishable. And above it all, I could see the vague outlines of Brest, a city that had not been spared by the war and was awaiting further destruction and surrender. Only now I fully realized, maybe for the first time, that everything, glory, successes, triumphs, had been irrevocably lost. It is impossible to recreate the past. U-953 passed the abandoned anti-submarine net and moved, ghost-like, further toward the neck of the river. Our escape took place under the cover of darkness, thickened by the hills and rocks surrounding the bay. At 3:45, we skirted the shallow water on a tidal wave. I steered the boat from memory, trying not to run aground. When the first gaps appeared in the sky from the east, we noticed motionless enemy torpedo boats ahead. They looked like black dots on the pearlescent surface of the sea. Meanwhile, we had not yet reached sufficient depth in the bay to allow us to go underwater. I continued forward at low speed, avoiding noise and risking the enemy detecting the boat. On the ebb tide, we were gliding toward the gunboats when the first glimpses of dawn appeared. I detected movements in the battle formation of the gunboats. They furrowed the surface of the sea and then headed for the rocks that rose on either side of the neck of the bay. It became clear that we could move no further in a surface position. At 4:23, we went underwater. The bow of the boat was slowly sinking into the sea. For long seconds, I watched the boat still moving. Then the water rushed into the horseshoe of the running bridge. I closed the hatch cover and listened to the splash of water covering the boat from above. As the small torpedo boats rushed in different directions, their propellers roared loudly, foaming the calm sea surface. At the moment when the chief engineer finished leveling the boat, I began to carry out my plan. I lowered it to a depth of 15 meters and began silent movement. In the distance, at a safe distance, 3 explosions of depth bombs. 4:40. U-953 plunged to a depth of 20 meters. More and more torpedo boats were snooping above us, throwing hand grenades to intimidate us. 5:08. Ahead, 6 depth bombs exploded off the starboard bow. Countless roaring propellers on the surface made us break out in a cold sweat and make grim predictions in the damp steel tomb. 5:20. Explosions of clusters of 12 depth charges erupted from the high seas. Astic pulses began to penetrate the water column at shallow depths. Ahead on the starboard side, new clusters exploded. The roars of their explosions rolled through the coastal waters and sounded in the distance for a long time. 6:45. The submarine sank to a depth of 40 meters. Torpedo boats remained far astern, continuing to throw grenades. Ahead, from Cape Kesson to the southernmost tip of the rocky coast of Brest Bay, the sea shook from the explosions of depth bombs dropped at random. 7:30. I changed the boat's course to south-southwest and lowered it to a depth of 50 meters. 8:10. We moved directly over the ocean floor, repeatedly getting stuck in sand drifts, but each time the current gently lifted us over the uneven bottom. A few miles away were 4 destroyers moving in a zigzag course at medium speed. On the starboard side, a group of sea hunters were probing the depths with radars in search of fugitives from Brest. Our civilian passengers were slowly dying of fear and nervous tension. 9:00. We took a new course of 200 degrees. Deprived of the ability to see and navigate by instruments, I relied entirely on my own intuition. With 2 switched-off electric motors, the boat was moving on the air cushion of the current directed to the south. The pulses of the Astic were hitting her hull with increasing force. The noise from the ships moving overhead was getting louder and louder. 9:40. The tide began to ebb. Glabma lowered the bow of the boat on the sandy bottom in 85 meters under the furrowed sea hunters. At least a dozen destroyers were restlessly whipping the water above us with propellers. They were constantly making circular motions, stopping, listening to the depth, dropping and dropping bombs, changing disposition, moving back and forth, stopping again, groping the bottom with locators and dropping depth bombs. the explosions from which pushed us onto the rocks and turned the hull of the boat into a torture chamber. Noon. U-953 moved downstream with trim on the bow, swinging smoothly like a pendulum. The explosions of depth bombs and the noise of propellers overhead kept every occupant of the boat alert. Yet the water gray, murky, warm, full of algae and ocean debris, protected the boat from bearing. 16.30. The tide began to weaken. The current began to change direction toward the open sea. U-953 raised her bow and resumed her motion over the uneven bottom. She slowly entered the Bay of Biscay amidst the scraping, heaving, and rumbling. When the noise gradually died down, it was clear that we had passed the range of the British ships and had escaped the trap. We had broken free, but remained prisoners of our own stench. The narrow steel cylinder of the boat was overflowing with the stench from the multitude of sweaty bodies, diesel and engine oil, and overflowing tin cans overflowing with feces. Some of the ship engineers were vomiting. August 24th. 3.00. It was a good time to ventilate the boat's compartments with a schnorkel. The operation required starting the diesels while underwater. The action of this device has long been a source of curiosity for me. Glavma took the boat to a depth of 14 meters, raised the mast pipe and dried it. Then the valves were opened. With a long whistle, fresh air rushed into the hull of the boat. One of the diesels started up, pumping more sea air into the hull. As the boat picked up speed, it went deep into the water at a steady pace. It was a miracle. I watched as the boat was reborn. There was no longer any need to go to the surface at mortal risk. Life inside the hull became bearable again. We recharged the batteries and sneaked around the eastern edge of the Bay of Biscay, which was swarming with enemy ships. Periodically, the engines were shut down and our habitat was monitored with acoustic instruments so that no hunter could locate our hull and take us by surprise with a devastating bombardment. As the new day dawned, I suspended our underwater ventilation operation. The periscope and float were retracted and U-953 went on, balancing at a depth of 40 meters. As the sun made its daily circular motion, U-953 continued to follow blindly southward in an underwater position. When midnight came again, we extended the float and periscope to the surface. No aircraft patrolling the bay noticed the tops of the schnorkel and periscope, although the pilots were flying quite low over the water. At dawn on August 26th, we managed to reach the southernmost point of our route. From here, I decided to make a quick passage eastward to the harbor on the Gulf Coast. 5 hours later, U-953 gently sank to the ground at a depth of 48 meters. I ordered the boat raised to periscope depth and discerned a thin line of coastline to the east. Looking carefully at the horizon, I noticed the swaying tops of masts and destroyer smokestacks to the north. It was only by chance that we went unnoticed by them. 13.20. When I once again extended the periscope, I saw that the coast rose in front of us like a wall. We were getting close to it, so close that it was becoming dangerous. I took immediate measures to prevent us from being swept ashore and commanded. Left rudder, heading 3 to 40. Soon we almost collided with the lighthouse on the northern tip of Olon Island. We saw a formation of 6 twin-engine airplanes flying at low altitude. I lowered my periscope as they flew over us. 3 minutes later, the sky was clear. I took several bearings from the lighthouse while my navigator Hennick plotted a course. We detected a strong current going north, and I realized that I would not be able to determine until nightfall when we could venture up to the surface and proceed to port. In the meantime, the boat was forced to wander underwater in the neighborhood where some of my friends had perished a few days before. I entered the central station room and busied myself with studying a map which contained a detailed description of the coastal waters around the 2 islands. Rhee Island, centered around the small town of St. Martin, had a dubious reputation. The ancient fortress had formerly served as a staging post from which the French had dispersed hardened criminals and political prisoners across the Devil's Island. 2 hours after sunset, we reached the surface. The lighthouse was gone. Believing that the current had carried us northward, I steered the boat south toward the tower that towered on the coast. We moved on electric motors so as not to attract the attention of destroyers or engage acoustic mines. 7 minutes later, I saw the tall, narrow tower through binoculars. Identifying it as a lighthouse, I reported it to the navigator, relying on his ability to guide the boat to the La Rochelle harbor anchorage. Time to turn east, new course 115, Hennick suggested. Hard left, course 1 to 1, 1 to 5, I commanded. The U-953 turned silently toward the shore. But the next moment it seemed to me that she hit the ground. A sudden scrape and a slight jolt indicated that the boat had indeed hit the bottom, slipped into the soft mud and stopped. "Blow ballast, full back," I shouted. The boat rose, the frantically turning propellers carried it out of the silt and into deep water. Ignoring the possibility of destroyers, I ordered the depth finder to be turned on, found a passage in the narrow channel, and steered the boat eastward, sometimes hitting the bottom. Something was really going wrong. As we moved forward for 4 hours, the lighthouse gradually disappeared astern. We couldn't find a landmark of any kind. I was even more doubtful when the bottom began to come closer to our keel again. Finally, the boat made a circle and hit the bottom several times. I was forced to conclude that we had fallen into a trap. At this time, the day was over and a fog had descended to the surface of the sea. We surfaced and anchored, expecting to continue moving when the fog evaporated under the sun. At 7:40, the fog settled, exposing the upper part of the shore. Soon it cleared completely. The boat came out of the fog as well. I hurriedly raised the anchor and started to check with maps and guidebook. At that time, there was an explosion about 100 meters off the port side. A muffled murmur of artillery fire followed. We were being shelled by our own artillery. Request, Herr Oberleutnant, our identification is requested. XO, give them our number by flashlight. Tell them to tell base we arrive in port at 2,300 hours. Realizing that I had entered the wrong bay, I ordered the chief engineer to dive urgently. U-953 sank to the muddy bottom with a slight jolt. The bridge guardrail was covered with 3 meters of muddy, gray water from the sand, and the tide had just begun. My promise to arrive in port before midnight had been overly optimistic. It was now quite clear that I had mistaken the lighthouse at the northern tip of Ree Island for the lighthouses of Olon Island. Since I had identified the lighthouse correctly the day before, I concluded that the strong current had carried us north an incredible 17 miles, and we had unknowingly rushed past the mine-strewn harbor entrance where 3 of our subs had blown up the previous week. Since all lighthouses looked the same at night, I had no reason to believe that I had taken bearing from the wrong tower. Besides, the passage to the cove into which I had been carried had characteristics almost identical with the one leading to La Rochelle. Now, nestled against the periscope, I was forced to watch the beginning of the recession and wonder how long we would be allowed to remain alive. Behind the lighthouse, the surface of the sea was being tracked by 3 British planes. Meanwhile, our bridge rose higher and higher above the murky gray water. 2 hours after noon, the tide stopped, but I was so intrigued by the daring flights of the planes that I did not notice the tide until the bridge was swallowed up by the seawater. Then, with a sense of relief, I went down to the central station room and there played cards with the chief mech and other submariners until nightfall. 21.30. U-953 rose to the surface when at full speed rumbling diesels out of the hostile bay, swept past the lighthouse for half a mile into the sea, turned south and moved parallel to the shore of the island of Ree to the port. We could see that we were being pursued by British destroyers, annoyed at the impunity of the submarine's daring dash. After an interminable hour of listening to the heaving radar pulses, we entered the strait leading to La Rochelle. Then, having stopped the diesels, I turned on the silent electric motors. Soon we noticed the silhouette of a small minesweeper sent to meet us. Having received our reply to the request, the ship hurried back to port, rattling its trawl. In front of it, 6 acoustic mines exploded in an arc at various distances. The explosion shook both the hull of our boat and the entire crew. On August 28th, Monday, at 2:30 U-953 finally slipped into her berth in the concrete bunker of La Palisa. It was the only submarine that had managed to relocate here from northern ports. When my fragrant morning coffee was brought to me, I pulled the curtain in my corner and turned on the light to savor the beverage. Cheered up, I left the boat to report my arrival to the commander of the 3rd Flotilla. On the way, I spotted only 2 subs, old vessels whose battle hulls were dented and rusted. There were signs of neglect and abandonment everywhere. Walking to the end of the cold, dark bunker, I stepped out into the damp morning air. After a short ride in the Citron, I arrived in the ancient walled city of La Rochelle. The car stopped in front of a 3-story building, and sentries showed me the way to the office of the commander. An obese officer of small stature, dressed in a faded khaki uniform, stood up from behind a desk. He was probably about 15 years older than me. "I have already been informed of your arrival," the officer said. "You didn't have to wait until today to enter the port. We were ready to receive you on weekends. You're lucky our gunners picked up your signal. They don't usually do that. Their orders are to fire on any approaching target. At first, they mistook you for a British submarine landing saboteurs. As you can see, we're well prepared to repel the landing party. Do you believe a siege of the port is imminent? Yes. They might try to land from the sea, but our artillery keeps them at bay. We are in a somewhat better position than Brest and Lorient. He briefed me on the measures taken by the Joint Command of the Armed Forces for the defense of the city. The German defense front of the coast of the Bay of Biscay was narrowing, and the naval defenders of La Rochelle were counting on a large influx of heavy artillery, tanks, and infantry into the city, which would relieve them of the unaccustomed functions of conducting defensive battles on land. The commander suggested that I send the extra submariners from U-15 and shipbuilding engineers to his adjutant, who would take care of their immediate transfer to Germany. All equipment removed from Allied besieged Brest must be loaded onto trucks and transported to German ports. Your boat must be ready to put to sea. For days in port, that's all I can offer you, said the commander. But, Herr Commandant, I need more time. My batteries and diesels should have been replaced months ago. I was told that new batteries would be put on the boat here. That's why we came here. You've been misinformed, he said stiffly. We have nothing. It's a pity, of course, but you'll have to wait for the boat to be refitted until you get to Norway. I could hardly contain my indignation, saluted, and left the commandant's office. In 4 days we will not be able to bring the boat out of the emergency state, let alone prepare it for a long combat campaign. Already a short passage from Brest revealed countless malfunctions. The longer we remained without repairs, the more trouble awaited us. On my return to La Pallice, I ordered my former officers from U-15 to go ashore with the crew and prepare to leave for Germany. I then informed the officers from U-953 of the lightning schedule to prepare to go to sea. To our disappointment, we soon discovered that all the German specialists from the shipyards had gone home in anticipation of the impending siege. We had to assign all our mechanics and motorists to the work of bringing the U-953 to a serviceable condition. On the pier, as well as in the parking lot, the activity began to boil. The heavy cargo, which hindered the repair, was taken out of the boat and loaded onto trucks. While the loading was in progress, the drivers were nervous, anxious to begin their trip eastward as soon as possible. The situation in port reflected the general confusion among our troops in France. While we were at sea, the Allies, advancing in all directions, had taken considerable territory. In Brittany, the Americans captured Nantes and advanced rapidly along the coast. Paris fell on August 24th, to the indescribable joy of the French. Advancing along the Côte d'Azur, the invasion force occupied Toulon and Marseilles. Our hopeless struggle in southern France was over. Everywhere in the territories we controlled, groups of saboteurs from the French resistance movement became active. Guerrilla units, which the Allies supplied by air with everything necessary, committed sabotage on our communications, supply routes, and retreat to Germany. Allied bombers bombed railroads and highways, and fighter planes machine-gunned long columns of troops leaving western ports. Thousands of men, untrained for land combat, were killed. Among them were secretaries, engineers, garrison clerks, sailors, shipbuilders, loaders, and automobile mechanics. Some refugee columns were reduced to pitiful clumps of men, stubbornly making their way to Germany. In the days of the general retreat in late August, 25,000 people evacuated from La Rochelle and neighboring ports. Among them were submariners from the former U-15, hundreds of sailors from other submarines that found no use in the war at sea. In Bordeaux, the crews of the U-123, U-129, U-178, and U-188 were forced to blow up their subs before making the journey home by land. Their passage through hostile France was accompanied by hellish trials and humiliation. Only a few managed to reach the borders of Germany. The rest ended up in their graves or behind barbed wire. In La Rochelle, the tragedy of the submarine fleet lasted a little longer. One submarine, the U-260, reached Norway in late August. She managed to break through the Allied blockade, but she also later blew up in a minefield near the southern coast of Ireland. With the departure of the U-260, my boat was the only one left in the giant concrete structure that housed more than 40 subs in the year of our highest naval power. U-953 was also the only submarine left in French ports. Since the beginning of the Allied invasion of the continent was destroyed 66 of our submarines and sunk enemy ships' tonnage of only 170,000 tons. Anti-submarine defense of the Allies became so effective that more than 3/4 of the submarines with Schnurkel, sent to fight the enemy landing craft, did not return to base. In the crucial days of August, One might have expected the British anti-submarine defenses along the shipping lanes through the Irish Sea and the northern straits to weaken, but only a few of our subs survived, counting on taking advantage of the interruption. With the destruction of at least 90% of the submarine fleet's operational units and the loss of all bases on the coast of the Bay of Biscay, headquarters was forced to cease combat operations in the Channel. The final act of tragedy was to be played out in the north. My submarine was stuck in a deplorable condition in La Rochelle. Realizing that France was irretrievably lost and that we had only a few days left to spend our last pay, I let the crew go out on Saturday afternoon for 3 hours to make purchases in the shopping aisles of the business section of the city. My pockets were stuffed with francs, but I found very few goods worth buying. I bought only a robe for my mother and silk stockings for my sister. By curfew, my submariners quickly returned to their temporary residence in the city, for at night our safety could no longer be guaranteed. It was not until morning that the bodies of 2 half-dressed naval officers were discovered in a gutter running along the edge of one of the streets. Each had his throat slit and his penis cut off. By the end of the week, U-953 still had not received an order to go to sea. My mechanics worked all Sunday to complete the most necessary repairs, but it wasn't until Tuesday, September 5th, that the chief engineer deemed the boat seaworthy, with some caveats and restrictions. I planned to go to sea on Wednesday night. On September 6th at 10 a.m., I walked into the commandant's office, draped in a freshly pressed uniform, to report to the commandant on the readiness of U-953 for the campaign. He received me informally and wished me good luck. The commandant then informed me that Captain Rosing, a high-ranking officer of Headquarters Division West, who was going to leave for Germany by airplane in the event of a siege of the city, had asked me to report to him. I was interested in what he had to tell me. I did not quite realize the scope of his duties, since the operational use of submarines was decided at Denitz's headquarters. An armored car was waiting for me, and we rushed through the city at such a speed that I could hear the tires squealing against the sidewalk. In a few minutes we arrived at a magnificent villa. Here preparations were everywhere for a hasty departure. Sailors were burning piles of documents on the lawn, cabinets and office equipment were being loaded onto trucks. I was led into the captain's elegant office. Rosing, dressed in snow-white pants, was packing tennis balls and rackets into a valise. Then he spoke curtly. "One day I flipped through your logbook. You're pretty good in shallow water. Is that your specialty? You seem to break through the blockades without difficulty." "Per captain, I acted according to the circumstances," I replied, annoyed for 2 reasons. First, he was the one who gave us last May the order to ram enemy ships with submarines. Second, it meant little to me to be complimented by a man who had commanded a boat for a very short time and probably had never heard a depth bomb explode. "All right, you're going to get a tough assignment this time," Rosing continued. He unfolded a map with my route plotted on it. I was to conduct operations in the northern straits, in the danger zone between the northern coast of Ireland and minefields west of Scotland. Detailed instructions were to be given by radio. Rosing handed me some maps of the minefields. He also explained how to get past the minefields at La Rochelle, break through the blockade of British ships and reach the target area. He finished by asking, "Any questions?" Since I had my own idea of navigation, I replied that there were no questions. We saluted each other, and that was the end of our peculiar meeting. I ran to the armored car and rushed on it to the compound, bypassing the military columns. There I packed my modest belongings and on the same armored car went to the bunker. On the way, I met several heavy tanks rumbling down the street and a column of infantry with field artillery moving through the city to take up their positions on the outer defensive line. From there came the deafening murmur of the approaching battle. In less than a week, La Rochelle had been transformed from a sleepy medieval town into a fortified battle station whose garrison was prepared to fight to the last man. Arriving at La Pallice, I lingered a little longer at the entrance to the concrete bunker, staring up at the sun. I deliberately savored those moments because I knew that at night I would go underwater with the boat and live in darkness for many weeks. I knew that at best I would not see the sun until the boat, having traveled 2,000 miles underwater, surfaced in the fall or, rather, winter in a Norwegian fjord. At worst, I might not see daylight at all and sink into an underwater grave, into eternal darkness. As I approached the boat, I was struck by the sight of the wooden containers of fresh vegetables on the deck. For a moment, it seemed as if nothing had changed since the glory days when I started as a submariner. But things had changed. Several hundred of our submarines were gone, like our victories on land. But at least one remained, doomed to die in battle. I called to the XO, who was supervising the loading of food, and told him, "We leave this trap at 1 o'clock in the morning. No escort, mind you. And please, no roll call. What about notifying the artillery batteries on the coast? Wouldn't want them to know we're leaving. The Tommies have ears everywhere. Better to risk being fired upon." After dinner at 8:30 p.m., there was a total blackout. I closed the curtain in my corner and stretched out on the green leather mattress. The burden of responsibility for the crew pressed down on me with all its weight. With the departure of the last submarine from our last port on the coast of the Bay of Biscay, the battle for the Atlantic had come to a bitter yet defiant finale.